in the heart of Constantinople, where marble palaces touched the golden skyline and priests whispered promises of divine order. The empire carried secrets far darker than its gilded mosaics. Behind the solemn chants of the Hagia Sophia and the cold steel of the Imperial Guard lay a world of lust, exploitation, and manipulation, a world where women were traded like coins, where bodies were spectacles, and where power itself could be carved out of humiliation. From this crucible of depravity rose a woman who would change history forever. Her name was Theodora, and though the world would one day call her Empress, her journey began in the filth of degradation, through the most horrifying sexual practices the Byzantine court and its underworld had perfected. The Byzantine Empire prided itself on being the Christian heir to Rome, a civilization of laws, faith, and civility. But beneath the piety of its rulers, sexual cruelty had become an instrument of both entertainment and control. Women, especially those born poor, were not simply ignored by society, they were consumed by it. The circus and theater became hunting grounds, where girls were paraded before men of wealth and rank, and every degradation was performed under the guise of art. Little girls were made to dance unclothed before jeering crowds, trained to serve not as human beings but as living objects of fantasy. The empire called it performance, but to those who endured it, it was slavery and enslavement of body and soul, no less brutal than chains. Theodora was born into this nightmare. Her father, a bear trainer for the city's circus, died when she was still a child, leaving the family destitute. Her mother, desperate to feed 3 daughters, pushed them into the only world that would take them, the theater, a place not of dignity but of spectacle, where women's bodies were commodities and humiliation the price of survival. It was here, in the damp chambers beneath the arena, that Theodora's education began, not in philosophy or scripture, but in the art of degradation demanded by Byzantine society. Men paid to watch her perform acts so vile that even chroniclers centuries later hesitated to record them in full, and yet the empire reveled in it, blind to the humanity of the child they consumed. Byzantine sexual practices were not born of love but of domination. Prostitutes were forced into acts, staged like theater plays, mocked, ridiculed, and used for the satisfaction of a class of men who believed themselves above shame. For women like Theodora, there was no choice, no escape, only submission or starvation. Even as she was forced to endure what no human being should, she learned something vital: to watch, to read men, to understand the raw machinery of desire and power. What destroyed many women became for her a forge, hardening her into something far more dangerous than the empire could imagine. It is easy to look upon Theodora's rise and see only scandal, but that is to ignore the human cost beneath the story. She was not alone. Countless women, nameless and forgotten, endured the same horrors, their bodies broken by a society that preached morality while practicing exploitation. The difference was that Theodora refused to remain broken. In every humiliation she suffered, she learned. In every act of cruelty inflicted upon her, she saw a truth about the men who claimed dominion over her. And in that truth, she saw a path. By the time she reached her teenage years, Theodora had already gained infamy in Constantinople. Chroniclers described her performances in grotesque detail, how she was forced into acts of public degradation that blurred the line between entertainment and torture. The empire's wealthy men watched, laughed, and consumed, never considering that the girl before them might one day hold their fates in her hands. And yet, Amid this cruelty, Theodora cultivated an extraordinary gift, the ability to bend perception. She learned how to make the powerless appear alluring, how to make weakness a weapon, and how to use her very survival as proof of strength. But her transformation was not merely personal. Her story echoes the struggle of all oppressed people, those who are told they are worthless, who are broken down by systems of cruelty, yet who carry within them the fire of resistance. Just as enslaved Africans, stripped of dignity and forced into bondage, preserved their humanity in song, in memory, in quiet defiance, so too did Theodora preserve hers. She carried within her the knowledge that those who abuse power are never invincible, that cruelty can be weaponized against the cruel, and that the oppressed may one day rule over their oppressors. Her chance came when she caught the eye of Justinian, the ambitious nephew of the emperor. He was captivated not only by her beauty, but by her sharp intelligence and fierce will. To the scandal of the court, he married her, raising her from the filth of the theater to the purple robes of an empress. The same men who once mocked her now bowed before her, and Theodora, unlike any empress before, carried with her the memory of every degradation, every humiliation, and every injustice she had endured. She had suffered what no noblewoman would dare imagine, and that suffering had armed her with the most dangerous weapon of all. Empathy sharpened into power. Once upon the throne, Theodora did not forget the women whose lives were still chained to the practices she had escaped. She pushed for reforms that offered prostitutes protection, that closed the theaters where young girls were sold into degradation, that created safe houses for those seeking to escape the brutal cycles of exploitation. She fought for women's rights in marriage, granting them more agency than Byzantine law had ever allowed. To the men of the court, she was ruthless, unyielding, and dangerous. To the women of the empire, she was a shield forged from their pain. The horrifying sexual practices of Byzantium had created an empress unlike any other. Where others saw shame, she saw strength. Where others sought to bury their past, she turned hers into a weapon. Her reign was not free of cruelty. She could be merciless to her enemies. But it was also a reign born of intimate knowledge of injustice. In Theodora, the empire found both its reflection and its reckoning. Her story is not simply one of scandal or depravity, but of survival against a system designed to destroy her. It is the story of a woman who rose from the lowest depths to command one of the greatest empires in history, and who used the very pain inflicted upon her to challenge the foundations of that empire. And in that story lies a universal truth, that even in the darkest practices of oppression, there can emerge a voice so powerful that it reshapes history. Theodora was not merely an empress. She was the embodiment of every silenced girl forced to dance for the powerful, every humiliated woman stripped of dignity, every life discarded by systems of cruelty. Her power was not given to her. It was taken, wrestled from the hands of those who thought she was nothing. In that, her legacy is not just Byzantine, it is human, and it belongs to every struggle for justice and dignity across history. Theodora's ascension to empress was more than a scandal, it was a declaration of war against the very systems that had once consumed her. From the moment she stepped into the palace, the marble walls seemed to whisper with disbelief. Senators sneered behind their polished masks, bishops muttered about her sins, and noble women refused to share her table. Yet, for all their scorn, Theodora stood taller than them all. She carried herself not as one who sought their approval, but as one who had already conquered what they feared most: humiliation. For a woman who had survived the empire's most degrading practices, the sneers of the powerful were nothing. Justinian adored her, but more importantly, he trusted her. And in the Byzantine court, trust was rarer than love. He listened when she spoke, and she spoke with a clarity that cut through the fog of flattery and deceit. She was not a woman of illusions. She had seen too much of the world's cruelty to indulge in fantasies. Her advice was sharp, grounded in the hard lessons of survival. Where Justinian dreamed of law codes and cathedrals, Theodora dreamed of justice for those who could not speak. It was under her influence that the Byzantine legal code was reshaped. No longer would men discard their wives on a whim, leaving women destitute. Divorce laws were revised, granting women a measure of security that had been unthinkable before. Brothels that once thrived on the broken bodies of young girls were shut down, and homes were established where women escaping exploitation could seek refuge. To the aristocrats, these reforms seemed small, but to the nameless masses of women who had never known protection, they were nothing short of revolutionary. Theodora's fight was not only for women. She had seen the empire's cruelty reach beyond gender, into every corner where the poor and powerless lived. Like the enslaved peoples across the empires of the world, Africans, torn from their homes, bound in chains, treated as commodities, so too had the Byzantines perfected systems to consume and discard human lives. Theodora recognized this injustice intimately, and though she could not dismantle the empire itself, she carved out spaces of resistance within it. Her courage was tested during the Nika riots of 532, when Constantinople itself was consumed by fire and fury. Tens of thousands rose against Justinian, demanding his overthrow, and the imperial court trembled in fear. Justinian, overwhelmed, prepared to flee, but Theodora would not. Standing before the men who claimed to govern the empire, she delivered words that would become immortal. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. Better, she declared, to die as an empress than to live as a fugitive. Her voice, forged in the theater of humiliation, now commanded the loyalty of soldiers and senators alike. Her defiance steadied Justinian, and together they crushed the revolt. Tens of thousands died in the hippodrome that day, but the throne endured because a woman once broken by the empire refused to bend to it again. Theodora's reign, however, was not without contradiction. She had risen from degradation, yet she could be merciless in wielding power. Her enemies accused her of cruelty, of silencing dissent with ruthless efficiency, and perhaps they were right. For Theodora had learned early that mercy was rarely extended to the powerless. Survival required strength sharper than steel. If she was harsh, it was because the empire she ruled left no room for softness. In her eyes, kindness without strength was a luxury, one she could not afford. Yet her harshness was tempered by a vision larger than herself. She saw the church not as an untouchable institution, but as a weapon that could be reshaped for justice. She involved herself deeply in theological disputes, lending protection to those persecuted for their beliefs. She understood what it meant to be silenced, and she wielded her authority to give voice to the marginalized, even when it defied the most powerful bishops in the empire. To her, faith was not about the preservation of power, but about the liberation of the soul. What makes Theodora's story haunting is not merely that she endured the empire's darkest sexual practices, but that she transformed that suffering into the foundation of her strength. Where most would be destroyed, she was remade. Her resilience resonates across history, mirroring the survival of enslaved peoples who endured whips, chains, and dehumanization, yet still carved out culture, song, and hope from despair. In Theodora, the lesson is the same. Oppression may wound, but it cannot erase the will to rise. Her later years were marked by both triumph and tragedy. She stood beside Justinian as he sought to reclaim the western provinces, as he codified Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a work that would echo across centuries. Yet her own health faltered, weakened by illness. She had lived a life that consumed her body long before the crown weighed upon her, and the scars of her early years never truly left her. When she died in 548, she was only in her 40s, yet she had lived more than most could in twice that span. The empire mourned, but it was the women of Byzantium, the forgotten, the silenced, the discarded, who had lost their fiercest defender. And yet her story is not confined to Byzantium. It is the story of how systems of exploitation, designed to destroy, can inadvertently create their own undoing. It is the story of how women, born into degradation, can wield that very experience to dismantle the structures that enslaved them. It is the story of survival as resistance, of pain transformed into power. Theodora's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. The Byzantine Empire, so often remembered for its glittering domes and religious devotion, was also a place of hidden horrors, where human bodies were treated as theater, where power was built on cruelty. To tell her story honestly is to strip away the gilded mosaics and see the shadows beneath. It is to recognize that history's most dangerous empress was not dangerous because of her beauty or her ambition, but because she had lived what the empire wished to hide. She was the living testimony of its hypocrisy. Her legacy lingers in every struggle for dignity. When enslaved Africans sang spirituals in the cotton fields, they echoed the same defiance Theodora spoke in the palace. That suffering does not erase humanity. When women across centuries fought for the right to control their own lives, they carried forward the fire she had lit in Constantinople's laws. And when the oppressed of every era rise against systems that tell them they are nothing, they walk in the footsteps of a woman who began as a child, forced into degradation, and ended as an empress whose name the world still remembers. Theodora's life is not meant to be admired without question. It is meant to unsettle us, to force us to see how cruelty breeds resistance, how pain creates power, and how history's darkest practices can inadvertently forge its brightest flames. She remains a paradox. A woman born into shame who became a symbol of defiance, a victim of exploitation who used her scars to shield others, an empress who ruled with both compassion and iron. And so, when we look back on her life, we must see not only the scandal of her rise or the reforms she enacted, but the deeper truth she represents. That dignity is not something granted by society, is something claimed, often in the face of a world determined to erase it. That even in the most horrifying practices of oppression, the human spirit can carve out freedom. And that sometimes, the most dangerous empress is not the one who inherits power, but the one who wrests it from the very hands that sought to destroy her.